border in a tour not so long ago. So I had the privilege of discussing with her what life is in Gaza, literally on the border. Since the disengagement, Israelis can't go into Gaza. So which is part of the reality that we face in Gisha, advocating for people we never meet. But I really appreciate this briefing, and I appreciate all of you taking the time to listen a little bit to life beyond the headlines, as Mital mentioned. So let me kick off with giving a little bit of just statistics, just to start with, like thinking of what Gaza means in practice. There are 2.2 million people who live in Gaza. Half of them are children under the age of 18, and a third are under the age of 30. It's a place with very high unemployment rates. A lot of the economic livelihood depends on the ability to leave the Gaza Strip and to seek work outside, especially in Israel. So there's a lot of demand for construction work, for agriculture, etc. I'll say a little bit about Gisha's mandate. So as Mital mentioned, we focus on freedom of movement because we identify it as a fundamental right from which a lot of other rights arise, be it the right to family life, the right to community. For Palestinians in Gaza who have been living under closure since 2005, since the disengagement I'll talk about a bit later, their right to freedom of movement depends on Israeli decisions because Israel controls crossings that would connect residents of Gaza to the West Bank and to Israel. So basically, people who live in Gaza depend on their ability to seek employment, to see their family members in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, or in Israel, to go out for holidays. We've just passed Ramadan and Easter, to go to worship in the holy sites. All of this depends on Israel's permit regime. Israel manufactures permits for Palestinians according to certain criteria. Those criteria are very strict, and the process is very lengthy and complicated. And Gisha, in its legal work, basically tries to facilitate that process and to defend Palestinians' right to freedom of movement in courts. So this is just a snapshot of what life is in Gaza is, not under attack as in the past week. So we're talking about a place that is, on the one hand, handling sort of very difficult situation that has been ongoing for a very long time, but on the other hand, that has sustained in a really remarkable way life, in which we see, again, people just want to do everyday things like you and me. They want to seek employment, they want to see their family, etc. So this is what we in Gisha focus on, and this is kind of where I want us to start by thinking about that. People who live in Gaza are people like you and me, and their wills and wishes are as any other human being.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dana. Because you said that, I'm actually going to jump around in my questions here a little bit, because what you said is a perfect segue into one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. So as most folks know, the sovereign, the governing body in Gaza is Hamas, has been since 2007. You're talking about Gazans, Palestinians in Gaza, who are, most of them, as you said, not involved with Hamas, not involved in the conflict. They just want to live their lives. It's seen a little bit different through the eyes of the Israeli government and how they grant those permits. Like you're talking about, it's a very difficult permit process, and not many are granted those permits. So can you talk a little bit about why that is, and how Israeli government policies kind of see civilians living in Gaza under Hamas?
Okay, so we have to jump back a little bit and talk about the disengagement in 2005, where Israel basically unilaterally withdrew both its forces and its settlements. So there were settlements in the Gaza Strip, and part of the disengagement was also in the north of Samaria, the West Bank. And in that way, Israel removed its forces and it saw itself as no longer an occupying power. Although, as I said, by controlling freedom of movement, by controlling the crossings, Israel de facto still controls the lives of people in Gaza. This was a very dramatic and unilateral move. And actually the founders of Gisha, Kenneth Mann and Sari Bashi, identified that there would be this kind of legal lacuna in which suddenly who is responsible, right? There was an occupying power and suddenly it withdraws. And that's one of the reasons that they founded Gisha and sort of shaped it in the way that it is shaped. What happened was that in 2007, Hamas gained power in the Gaza Strip, and Israel declared all of Gaza a hostile entity and refused to engage directly anymore with Hamas. Now, I want us all to imagine living under a regime, a government that controls all aspects of our lives. So as I said, Israel controls freedom of movement and any kind of ability to leave the Strip, but within the Strip, Hamas is the sovereign. This means that any person who, for instance, works in the post office is a Hamas employee because he works for the government is controlled by Hamas, etc., etc. Most citizens in Gaza just want to live their life. They have maybe political interests. They have interest in having Palestinian sovereignty, which is, I think, a human wish. I really like doing events with Canadians because I really appreciate the kind of land recognition that you have in the beginning. And I strive to the day when we're able to do this here. And I think just thinking about what it is, the right to self-determination, the right to sovereignty. So there is a regime in power that is kind of offering one image of that, but in reality, they're living under a regime like any other. Israel declared Hamas a hostile entity and doesn't engage with Hamas anymore. So again, there is a discrepancy between what Hamas as a body does, and I should say that we in Gisha obviously condemn all violations of international law. That includes both throwing rockets on Israeli citizens. Personally, I'm Israeli. I have family living not far from Gaza. We all are affected by this. But we see in the kind of wider scope of things, there are 2.2 million people who are affected by how Israel perceives all of this Strip is kind of an extension of Hamas decisions. And this is why we defend, our focus is on the human rights of people living in the Strip beyond the kind of politics that goes on beyond that.
Thank you. So, you kind of alluded to, takeover of Hamas. They have been in power since 2007, as you said. And as I said in my introduction, there's been, I guess it comes to almost one operation, like Israeli operation in Gaza per year since the disengagement, since Gaza took over. So 15 operations in which we do see, yes, we see militants taken out, but we always see civilian collateral damage as well on both sides. And like you said, of course, at JSpace Canada as well, we condemn human rights violations in the form of obviously the indiscriminate bombing and killing of innocent civilians. But I think the question that I struggle with, that I think a lot of other people struggle with, is like, yes, recognizing that there is hostile entity and control. Yes, realizing the desires of Hamas and with this round, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But an operation every year, it's like it feels a little bit like madness. Like, what is the Israeli government trying to do with these operations? And they tout success. Bibi, after this one, is saying that it was successful and Israel is victorious. Is that actually true? Is anything happening? Is violence being deterred? Is terrorism being deterred? And if these operations aren't the way out, then what is the way out? Really easy question for you, Dana.
So I want to, just like give me a minute, I'll answer all of it. I want to answer with some data. I think sometimes numbers speak volumes. So initial estimation of the Gaza Ministry of Agriculture assumes the damage. This is 5 days of fighting, $1.3 million. This is true of yesterday. 93 housing units have been completely ruined. 128 housing units have been partially damaged and cannot be inhabited anymore. 1,820 units were partially damaged and can be inhabited. I think it's important to remember this. We haven't even spoken about the death toll. I do want us to again acknowledge, I think recognition is really very important. Today is a day to remember that. We're talking about 34 people who are dead. out of them 6 children. We're talking about injured around the 147, often that number changes. One of the people who died, by the way, is a worker from Gaza who was meant to build the roof in one of the shelters in the south and was actually killed by a missile. So I think this is kind of a way also to answer your question about the tragicness of these circles, where you have people who are basically becoming fodder for these kind of circular violences. Now, I don't want to give political analysis here because I think, there's enough people doing that. There's all of the kind of what are the goals. I want to talk about what this means in practice. If we're thinking about 15, when you said that number, it blew me away. I kind of knew it, but still hearing it from you, 15 operations. You just heard the total, and this is one of the shorter ones. Imagine what it's like to live when this is what's happening to you year after year, and you know that at some point it will happen. Our field coordinator wrote a really beautiful blog. So Gisha has a field coordinator in Gaza that I would be glad to share with the participants. Just what it's like to live life with this kind of constant feeling of any day now this could happen again. In terms of realpolitik, I mean, if it was that successful, I don't think you need to do something that is successful 15 times. But again, I think kind of looking at it through the human rights prism, it's very hard to justify this amount of wreckage and civilian life lost in any way. Obviously, any life lost by targeting civilians is a war crime. This is true again everywhere you apply it, is just a very basic definition of international human rights law and international law. So I think, again, when you think about this kind of circularity and you think about the routine of living in one operation after another, Gisha did a really interesting and really heartbreaking research. So last year we marked 15 years of the closure, which is a really kind of grim landmark to reach. And we kind of started talking to young people who only know life under closure. So imagine you're born into a community and you can never really leave. And very often those young people, they say they want to leave and not return, but they actually just want a decent place to live in. So I think it's a misconception of people just want to flee Gaza. They want to live in a place with decent housing. They want to live in a place where they have decent opportunities. They want to have the ability to dream and fulfill their dreams. We often, by the way, some of our clients might be young people who want to go to university. In order to leave for academic work, you still need to get permits, etc. In the same way that you would want to go and travel and study elsewhere, imagine there's a foreign body that has to approve all of that process for you. So looking at young people living under closure, one thing that we saw and we've been kind of trying to elaborate more is just the effect on mental health of young people and basically everyone living under these conditions that, as I said, generally are really very hard. Economic oppression, poverty, high unemployment, but also these kind of circles of violence that just create impossibility to plan anything and impossibility to sort of say, I'll just live life as it comes to me. So I think, again, let us think about people as people and what this still means for just living everyday life under this circularity.
I see there are some questions in the chat. I want to ask you one more question, then we'll get to some audience questions. So yeah, for sure. I hear everything that you're saying. Absolutely. There is the situation of, Hamas has not called elections. Hamas is still the governing body. The work that Gisha is doing is of course admirable. And, we can really agree with everything you're saying in terms of human rights and just the vast majority of civilians who are living there and just want a normal life. With Hamas in control and with the closure as it is, can you talk about what's the tactics for Gisha? How are you able to make change, and what are the barriers that you come up against? What are the barriers you come up against, and what is the change that you're actually able to make given what the situation is?
So thank you for that. Gisha has a twofold kind of strategy and goal. So on the one hand, we do individual litigation. We have inter-coordinators who sort of women and man hotlines from Gaza where people call us and ask for help with their permits. Very often, I should say, our inter-coordinators are all Palestinian because they need to speak Arabic. And very often their job is incredibly hard because I just will say for everyone's general knowledge, Israel allows people to leave, apart from workers' permit that I saw already a question in the chat, and that's a really important question. In the case of either a direct first degree relative wedding, or funeral or terminal illness. So if your second cousin is getting married in the West Bank, you won't get a permit. If your aunt is dying, you might not get a permit. So a lot of what our staff have to do is first to just sift through the requests, which is unbearably hard, because just imagine sitting at the phone and getting the phone call saying, my cousin is really ill, I want to go and visit them. And you kind of say, I'm sorry, but the Israeli authorities don't think that's a good enough reason for you to travel. So we have litigation that goes with a very, very specific criteria that Israel imposes. Even with those criteria, it's kind of a lengthy process. For medical emergencies, there's also a specific permit, but again, you have to prove all sorts of elements in the procedure, and it's not straightforward at all. For instance, we had a client, let's say client in parenthesis, an 80-year-old boy with a very severe lung disease. He got a permit and his family didn't. So they basically, the Israeli authority said, send the child over the border if you think you can send an 80-year-old child through a crossing that sometimes the way takes 3 and 4 hours, and then go on their own to reach life-saving medical treatment. Then I don't know, that's like a common sense that I don't understand. Anyway, so on the one hand, we do this kind of very specific legal litigation. We have a very impressive, and I should say inspiring, legal team that goes to courts and argues before courts based on individual cases, and sometimes also argues kind of principled petitions. If we see a number of cases that come from the same kind of family of being refused for whatever reason. Israel is allowed to put what we call a security block on permit applications, and then it very often doesn't have to explain why it does that. So as I mentioned, since Hamas took power and all of Gaza is considered a hostile entity, anyone who is seen to have any connection with Hamas, any direct connection, can be claimed a security threat, and their permit can be blocked. Once Israel says that it has seen someone as a security threat, it doesn't have to give explanations. It very often says, because of confidentiality, I can't give any more information, and that's the end of the permit process for that person. Although we have seen that very often when we go to court with a security block, the security blocks are removed very quickly. So we know that it's a kind of way to block permits without having to give reasoning. So it's the way to stop the process. That's one avenue in which we work. However, Gisha is also an anti-occupation organization. We work under the understanding that freedom of movement for Palestinians will never be guaranteed under occupation. So it's not that we're just trying to make people, help them cross the border and then say, leave things as they are. So we do advocacy both locally with Israeli audiences and internationally. So my own role is doing international advocacy. And sort of trying to show how Gaza fits into the general kind of framework of occupation as we understand it now. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak with Oivin. I'm really grateful that you took the time, because very often with events unfolding as they are in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Gaza is usually not on the agenda unless it is being bombed. That's like the hard but true reality. And Palestinian communities, Palestine is spread all around this whole land. You can't ignore Gaza. You can't think that you can end the occupation without thinking about what will happen with Gaza. And people live in Gaza who have lives outside of Gaza, who have families in the West Bank, who have families in East Jerusalem, who have families in 1948 Israel. So I think for us, understanding how Israel governance kind of does literally divide and conquer, it keeps, we call it the separation policy. We understand it's a separation policy, separating the West Bank from Gaza and trying to sort of keep communities apart, families apart, and just to get the world and Israelis to think about these as two different spaces. So we in Gisha try to advocate and show the complete picture of what Gaza means for the entire space.
Okay, great. I'm going to go to some questions. I see we have some in the chat and we have some hands up. So I'm going to go in order. I'm going to read Oded's question, then I'm going to go to Norman. I see you have your hand up, and then I'm going to go to Shell's question. So let's start with Oded, who asked, how many working permits does Israel provide to Gaza residents, and what have been the trends since Gisha started their work?
Okay, that's a really, really great question. So we're now seeing a so-called high of between 17,000 and 20,000 permits. It depends on how you count them. This is a high since 2004, since before the disengagement. However, when you think about a population of 2.2 million people, and most of them young people, this is nothing. So we work with a lot of workers. We advocate for a lot of workers. We see that also as when you see the larger picture of economic rehabilitation and trying to ensure just like basic living conditions. This is really very vital for the people in Gaza. But the permit regime and sort of allowing just people to exit in these numbers will never allow for a large scale change in Gaza and will never allow for economic flourishing. So that's where we are with workers right now.
Thank you. Norman, if you want to come off mute and ask your question, I see you have your hand up. I'd invite you to do so now.
Okay, I'm off mute. Thanks very much. Very interesting. And I see that the focus is very much on freedom of movement. I wonder if Gisha looks at the wider picture, because what we've got to worry about is things like a port. We've got to improve the economic situation within Gaza so that Hamas is not seen purely as a terrorist organization, but starts to worry about the economic wherewithal of the territory itself. Does Gisha get involved in such future thinking?
I will say, so thank you for your question. So I'll take it in two parts. So Gisha focuses on freedom of movement because of the closure, because Israel is controlling basically any possibility to do anything that depends on freedom of movement. We do a lot of structural analysis. We do a lot of economic analysis. We're not a political organization. We don't get involved in Hamas, kind of where it sits within the strip. Also, I should say ideologically, Palestinian life is Palestinian life. Sovereignty is sovereignty, whether we like it or not. We do see economic flourishing is key for any kind of decent life in Gaza and elsewhere, everywhere in Palestine, Israel. So we do kind of focus on that, but our focus is very specifically on freedom of movement. I don't think it's a narrow focus. I think it's a very kind of fundamental right that if you look at an area that is so dense and living under closure for 16 years, everything else is derived from that. If you improve people's freedom of movement, if you basically allow them to make their own will, to sort of seek their own freedoms, to fulfill their needs and wishes, then everything carries through. So this is our focus.
And there's another question in the chat. Are there foreign NGOs that are focused on employing folks for rebuilding? If you know that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of humanitarian aid and there's a lot of sort of foreign NGOs that are being involved. I should say, of course, all these attacks, as I said, I gave you some statistics of the effect on the ground of these attacks. And obviously, again, every help and support is appreciated. I do think, again, that for us in our analysis, the focus is on achieving a situation in which there is sovereignty and there is an ability for Gaza to sustain itself, because humanitarian money and foreign money often kind of diverts the economy in strange ways. So a lot of NGOs do really, really worthwhile and important work, but we would like to see a situation in which Palestinian people in Gaza are able to govern themselves and fulfill what they wish to do.
Okay, so I also wanted to ask you, looking forward a little bit, to the extent that maybe you can, I don't know how much this is in your purview, but I do want to ask the question because something that is coming up like pretty much, I mean, it was being a little bit talked about before the ceasefire and definitely after the ceasefire. I think it's on a lot of activists and advocates' minds, is the fact that Jerusalem Day and the Flag Day March is coming up. I don't know if folks know about that. If you want to maybe at the beginning of your question or beginning of your answer, give us a little bit of background as to what that is and what that's going to look like. We know that Ben Veer is very excited to attend this year, and analysts are saying that this could cause another flare up. So I'm wondering, how steady actually is this ceasefire given what's about to come up? And do you see that actually, like, is there a possibility that I think it's on Thursday, that we are going to see some sort of renewed fighting?
So I'll just say, and thank you for this question. So basically on Thursday, it's the Jerusalem Unification Day, which is also, if you look from the other side, it's the day in which East Jerusalem was occupied. There's traditionally a flag march that passes through the city, but then also passes through the Muslim Quarter and through Palestinian neighborhoods. And I should say, it kind of sounds, I say a flag march, but it's very kind of extreme right wing, and it's very kind of using nationalistic symbols. It's often violent, so it's sort of eliciting violence in Palestinian neighborhoods. 2021, I'm sure everyone on this call remembers, the violence was partly escalated through that day and the flag march. It's actually 2 years, so like it's kind of ironic that we had this Israeli attack occurred exactly 2 years after that. In terms of probability, I don't know. I think what I would say is that every ceasefire in Gaza is always fragile, and we always know that things can undergo upheaval. And I think, again, what we focus on sort of talking to people is that you're never really safe, and you never really think that what your tomorrow will look like. Will you be able to go about your life or not? I think it's fair to say that things have been really volatile since this government took office. But I think this escalation was unforeseen. So we don't know. I think for all of us, I've been in Gisha for 7 months, and I think the day I started working was the day that I prepared myself for an Israeli attack on Gaza, because I knew looking through the documents that it's so repetitive and it's so circular that it could break out when we least expect it or when we most expect it. And that's part of, again, the kind of hopelessness and depression of living in under siege, really under closure, and having these circles of violence elicited on you.
I see there's some questions in the chat, and I also see that Shell has her hand up. So Shell, I'll go to you if you want to unmute and ask your question, and then we'll go to the question in the chat.
Yeah, my earlier question regarding foreign money was more in terms of rather than work permit. I totally am aligned with and appreciate the strategy of getting work permits and family need permits. Mobility is enormous, and I think that's quite brilliant to focus on that, as that leads to all the other things. But what I'm also wondering about, and it was when you were talking about the recent strikes and the impact of that is to create more homelessness, destroying buildings.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about within Gaza and other parts of Palestine to be focused on, rather than the workers having to leave and go build something for the Israelis, to be able to stay home and rebuild for themselves. That's where my question was coming from in that area.
Okay, so thank you for that clarification.
And does somebody focus?
So of course, yes. So the answer is yes. So I'll sort of give our perspective. Obviously, we want to see Gaza's economy being generative enough for people to work there, but it is really important to understand and to remember that Gaza is, again, part of the entire territory between the river and the sea. And on the one hand, I share your wish, and we feel very strongly want to see more independence, but there will never be completely, it's as if I would say there was one province of Canada that will be associated. We want to have it really strong, and then everything will be fine. People's lives are intertwined in lives in Israel and the West Bank, not just economically, but just personally and humanly. So I think, of course, we want to see strengthening of Gaza's economy. We work on that also, but we also understand that this is all part of the same picture. It's isolating communities, it's breaking down relationships, and it's imposing. And right now, the easiest way to sort of bring money to Gaza to keep the economy going in some way is to have these kind of permits. Again, we are an organization that calls for an end of the closure and an end of the occupation generally. So it's not just like make things a little bit better, give 20,000 more permits and then everything will be great. But it's also understanding what is the longer term change that we're trying to advocate for, that again really resonates with what you're saying of having more Palestinian sovereignty, more Palestinian economic independence, but also very in the very groundwork of what we do is understanding that Gaza has to be connected to the West Bank, to East Jerusalem, and to 1948 Israel, because it's the same people. I mean, when you start thinking about what separation means, it's very literally tearing families apart. We do a lot of casework of families that haven't seen each other, people who haven't seen their grandkids, cousins who don't know each other. So this is a kind of reality, social reality we're dealing with, and this kind of where the focus also comes from.
Just one more brief comment. When you said the problems about foreign money coming in and how that upsets the balance, I deeply know about that. My husband and my family through him are Cubans, and the foreign money there has totally disrupted society, and some of the great advances have been destroyed. Simply like a bartender earns more money than a doctor.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you to like dig deep into your philosophy brain here. We have two pretty big questions from Wolf. The first one is, do you have an opinion on what supporting this kind of system by Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora, does to the Jewish psyche? I have some opinions on that. And does international law allow resistance to occupation?
I'll take the second one first, because I think it's kind of easy. I mean, the occupation is allowed under international law with some provisos, being that the occupation has to be temporary and the occupier has to guarantee, it's basically the guarantor of the human rights of the occupied. So in theory, Israel could continue doing what it's doing if it was guaranteeing Palestinians human rights, defending their human rights under occupation. As an anti-occupation activist, this is not just me and Gisha, but like generally all of us in the community looking at the occupation, Israel is denying very, very basic rights of people living under occupation, both in Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, etc. So in theory, the occupation means one thing. In practice, we're talking about at least 55 years of occupation. We're talking about just deepening the systems of control and not respecting people's very basic human rights. In terms of resistance to occupation, again, like international law is very dry and boring. It talks about very specific conditions. It doesn't really look at resistance as a political kind of act. But again, what occupation means in international law is not necessarily what occupation means, how we understand it politically and how we talk about it here in this webinar. It means a very kind of dry definition, and it entails specific things. I think the first question is really interesting. I'm going to take that. First of all, I do want to say and acknowledge that all of you who came here in the middle of your Monday, I do appreciate that. And I think, supporting work being done, dissenting against maybe things that you were raised with, maybe values we hear around you, maybe news reporting, it's not an easy thing. So I think to dissent in itself carries a toll. I think in terms of supporting the system and sort of, it is very ingrained. I'm 41 and I can't remember my life outside of thinking about this system. The closure is 15 years maybe, but the occupation goes back much more. I think actually, when you think about the kind of work that we do, I think that defending human rights is a very Jewish value. I think that when you look at certain readings of the Bible and of various other Jewish sources, you really see where the idea of human rights can be derived from textually. I have a book I love written by the late great judge Chaim Cohen, who was one of the really greatest human rights defenders, and he really kind of breaks down how human rights are connected to Jewish law. So I think, I want to say that, and I know that's something, as someone who's lived abroad for a long time, it's very painful sometimes to see Jewishness being taken by people like Ben-Gvir and being kind of appropriated under certain values. But I want to say that the work that Gisha does and the work that all of us in the Israeli-Palestinian human rights community do is also, it's another reading of the Jewish psyche. So I'll say that.
That's a great answer. Thank you. So I wanted to actually ask you, let's go back to Gisha's work and let's go back to that kind of drawing on Jewish values. I wanted to ask about, and I think this is going to be the last question. We don't have any more in the chat. So I'm just going to ask you about the appeal that you recently submitted to the Israeli authorities. So it was Gisha, Adala, Physicians for Human Rights, and El Mezan Center for Human Rights. I'm not going to give any more away. Can you just talk about what it means to work? First of all, what it means to kind of work collaboratively between Israelis and Palestinians, and what that appeal was, and why that was important at this time.
So, thank you. That's a great question to close on. So I'm going to just say a few words about the appeal and then why it's significant. So we basically, on Thursday, we wrote an urgent letter. I think you mean that, right? Like the letter that called to open the crossings. So the moment that attack started, Israel closed the crossings, impacting hundreds of patients, impacting, as I said, workers seeking employment, but just like, people who need urgent medical care. We had actually one client who was seeking urgent medical care, arrived at the crossing and then saw that it was closed. So calling to open the crossings, we condemn the bombings, we condemn the Israeli attack, but we also really strongly condemn closing the crossing, which is something that very often doesn't make the headlines. I think it's interesting to see when Gaza is being reported, the headlines often don't even acknowledge the fact that suddenly complete closure is placed on Gaza. So I think this appeal is really very important because, again, it goes to the heart of what it means to control every aspect of life of a civilian population and to deny it its very basic freedom. And again, I really deeply believe that everything we do depends on our ability to seek our own fortune and to live the life in the way that we wish. I was really fortunate to travel and to fulfill a lot of things I wished. I don't think there's a reason why a Palestinian in Gaza should have less ability to do that. In terms of working collaboratively around the community, I have to say, I personally really love the Israeli-Palestinian human rights community. It's obviously not always rainbows and unicorn as any professional community is, but there's a very strong understanding of solidarity and of what things are really desperate right now for us. And working towards this common goal that we all really deeply believe in. All of us could have done a lot of other things that I can say personally. My life in Oxford was really nice and relaxed, and writing books on the banks of a beautiful river was pretty pleasant. But really to believe very deeply in our commitment and our responsibility as Israelis and as Palestinians, obviously from different perspectives, to defend Palestinian human rights and to end the occupation. And I think we all felt that this was the most urgent thing to do. So of course, we also advocated and sort of worked opposite different audiences. And if you don't follow us yet on Twitter, we tweet in 3 languages. Everything we release is in 3 languages. So I do encourage you to join our mailing list. I promise we don't bombard, but we send updates such as today or tomorrow, and one will come out. And we tweet a lot about our cases and data and stories that you wouldn't hear elsewhere about Gaza and what it means to be a Palestinian in Gaza. So I think, to me, I'm an optimist by heart and nature. I don't think you can do this work if you're not. And it also means that you deal with really hard truth and data and facts, but you sort of think, what can I do to make things better from my position? So for me, these actions are really very urgent and vital on many levels. And I think that our commitment is really to keep Gaza on the agenda and to remember that 2.2 million people just want to live their life. And it's our responsibility as human beings to help them be able to do that freely and to fulfill what they wish for themselves.
Awesome. So thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that we have. So I just want to ask you before we do finish, and you've given us so much to think about today. If there's one thing that you could leave us with, I think, like you said, there's a lot of narratives that we have, that we were raised with, that are very prominent within the Jewish community. Challenging ourselves and challenging our narratives, like you said, is not an easy thing to do. There are often moments of discomfort. There are also moments where our narratives clash and conflict with the narratives of others. So I want to ask you to push us a little bit here. What's a challenge? What's a challenge or what's a narrative? Especially you did reference today being a day that Palestinians mark as Nakba Day. That's probably a challenging narrative for a lot of us to confront. So especially on a day like today, what is something that you want us to leave with, that you want us to challenge ourselves with?
I want us to remember that for everything that we as Jews, whether in the diaspora or Israelis, hurt and feel personally implicated and maybe feel offended, what is life like for Palestinians for whom the narrative might be completely the opposite? So in the same way that it would have taken us a lot of time to be able to just even think about what the Nakba might mean and what histories mean in different ways, again, the closure has been ongoing for 16 years, the occupation at least 55 years, to try and think what it feels when we are personally pushed back. And I think it's a very human response. And we often feel that in conversation when we're being thrown with the concept we don't like hearing, like Nakba, like apartheid, like why am I so angry when I hear apartheid? What is it in me that makes me feel that way? And also what it might mean to someone who comes from the other side of history, who comes from a completely different narrative. So I think when we feel this discomfort, I'm a firm believer that we can't do away with it. Like just being cross with yourself and being like, no, I shouldn't feel discomfort isn't helpful, it isn't productive, but to think about where we are in the community more broadly. And again, I think Canada has a lot of things that we can learn from. And I think just like land recognition and understanding what it means to share a piece of land that a lot of us have different relationships to is something that we can really push ourselves to do beyond where we are physically now. So I try to do that every day. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's really painful, but if we want to make things better, if we want to see transitional justice really take hold, recognition is really a precondition.
That's great. I think that's a really beautiful and hopeful and optimistic note to end it on, which in times like these, it's not always easy to find those. So I really appreciate it. So I do want to say thank you. First of all, thank you so much to everyone who joined. As Donna said, it's a Monday afternoon and we got this put together in really short notice. So Donna, thank you for being available on such short notice. To everyone who joined, thank you for spending this time with us this hour. And I just do want to say a last little bit of our JSpace spiel, which is that we really could not do these events, bring in these speakers and run these programs without you. We are an all volunteer organization. We do this just out of passion and love and our commitment to Zionism and to our Jewish values. So the best way, we do try to bring a webinar, some sort of programming every month. And so if you can support us monthly, that is the best way to be able to ensure that we can continue to have amazing guests like Dana, like the work of Gisha featured to a Canadian audience. We have been recording this, so I will upload the recording. I will send it out in a couple days, along with a link to Gisha's social media and website, as Dana mentioned, and some other articles around what we talked about today so that you can kind of think about this further and have these discussions further. And as always, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, we don't send out any official surveys or anything like that because we really just love hearing from you as authentically as possible. So feel free to send us an email, info@jspacecanada.ca, and we get back to you and we'd be happy to chat further. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Dana, thank you so much for bringing us this perspective. And fingers crossed that we don't see any further flare-ups this week or any further into the future. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.